afternoon or good morning to you, depending on where you're listening in from at this point. Many people, I think probably everybody on this call, is well familiar with the recommendations for exclusive breastfeeding. We focus a lot of attention on the first 6 months of life. But our focus today is really going to be talking about the continuation of breastfeeding. It's part of our recommendation to continue breastfeeding for at least 2 years or beyond. I want to talk about kind of why that is and what some of the implications of that might be. Let's see, you need to get where I have control. Okay, there we go. So based on a request from the World Health Assembly in 2012, WHO developed guidance on ending the inappropriate promotion of foods for infants and young children. And this guidance really tries to affect a number of different outcomes. It's guidance to make sure we're protecting breastfeeding, that we're preventing obesity and chronic diseases, and that we're generally promoting a healthy diet. The scope of that guidance really was dealing with products that were specifically marketed for the age range of children 6 to 36 months of age. So it didn't include infant formula in the first 6 months of life. It really was trying to deal with what about these continuing products that might be complementary foods or milks for older children. And so it was defined as any product that was labeled or marketed specifically for babies, infants, toddlers, young children, that it had something about a recommended timing of introduction that would be sometime in the first 3 years of life, or that there might be images on it that implied that it was for children less than 3 years of age, or might have a recommendation or a picture of feeding it with a bottle that also implied that it was a product for babies or young children. It does not include products that are marketed to the general population. We know that babies eat many things that are on the family table and recognize that they're going to be eating a very wide diet. We're not talking about the promotion of foods to the general population, even though they might be consumed by this age group, but it's products that are actually targeted to that age group. There are 7 recommendations in the 2016 guidance, and we're really going to focus today on recommendation 2. Which, among other things, said that a breast milk substitute should be understood to include any milks or products that could be used to replace milk, such as fortified soy milk. It may not be a cow's milk or goat's milk product, in either liquid or powdered form that are specifically marketed for feeding of infants and young children up to the age of 3 years, including follow-up formula and growing up milks. So what we're really going to do today is really kind of talk through why did we come to that recommendation? What is the rationale for WHO recommending that we need to consider breast milk substitutes up to 3 years of age? And the first is really to understand the breastfeeding recommendations themselves. We've had a lot of attention to initiation in the first hour of birth. In fact, World Breastfeeding Week last year really focused a report on what was going on in the first hour. We've had a long time attention to breastfeeding exclusively for the first 6 months of age. But we can't forget about the third part of WHO's recommendations about breastfeeding, which is to continue with nutritionally adequate and safe complementary foods up to 2 years of age or beyond. So why? Why do we have that recommendation for continued breastfeeding for at least 24 months? And there are really 4 strains of the logic there. One is that it prevents child mortality. Second, that it contributes to optimal nutrition. It prevents childhood obesity, and it protects against diseases for the mother herself. So we're going to walk through a little bit of some of the literature behind these recommendations. In 2015, Sanker et al. Published a meta-analysis on child mortality outcomes of breastfeeding. Within that analysis, they examined the mortality effects specifically of breastfeeding in the second year of life. So they looked at babies who were 12 to 23 months of age and compared those to babies who were not continuing to breastfeed. So they either had breastfed up until 12 months and stopped, or just had not been breastfed at all. I don't know if it's possible if someone can mute their phones because we're getting some background noise there. And what they found were there were 6 studies that were published that had that particular comparison in the second year of life. And essentially all of them found that there was a protective effect against child mortality. This is any cause mortality. Some of them with very large effects, and 3 of them that were statistically significant on their own. When they brought those 6 studies together and did a meta-analysis looking at the total power, they found a net effect of about 1.97 as the relative risk of death to the child if they did not breastfeed in the 2nd year of life. The conclusion there was that children who are not breastfed at 12 to 23 months of age are about twice as likely to die as those who are breastfed. Critically important reason for us to continue breastfeeding throughout that time period. Secondly, we know that continuing to breastfeed is optimal nutrition for the baby. While the baby needs to have complementary foods in addition, we know that breast milk provides an important addition to the nutrition of the child. On average, we find in developing countries that breast milk contributes 550 grams per day, which accounts for 35 to 40% of their total energy needs. And in one study, when they looked at the micronutrient content of the breast milk and looked at that total contribution in terms of the volume, they found that 70% of the vitamin A that children were getting in the Gambia came from breast milk, 40% of their calcium, 37% of their riboflavin. And so if they were not being breastfed, they would miss out on many of those nutritional benefits. We also have literature that documents what happens to feeding when the baby gets sick. And breast milk intake actually doesn't have the same anorexic effects that we see with other feeding. And so breast milk intake actually does maintain, even though the appetite declines for other foods when the baby gets sick. And the consequence of that is a reduction in the duration of illness and improved nutritional status of the baby. And so that growth faltering that we see because of illness is actually prevented by the continued breast milk intake even out through the 2nd year of life. Those benefits are particularly important in low-income countries, but we know in high-income countries, they don't have as high mortality rates, and they have access to good nutrition through other kinds of sources. And so they might say that, well, it doesn't really matter for us for breastfeeding to continue. And there are additional arguments that are important in those settings as well. There's a huge concern about the obesity epidemic in high-income countries. And so in a meta-analysis published by Horta et al. In 2015, they looked at a large number of studies that looked at the relationship between breastfeeding and obesity. What they found overall was a 26% reduction in the odds of becoming overweight later in life, as they looked across all of the studies. And an even stronger effect when they looked at the children in the 10 to 19-year age group. Among adults, it was somewhat smaller effects, but also a smaller number of studies of how important breastfeeding was in those early years on the odds of becoming overweight 20 years down the road. So we're looking at very long-term effects of this feeding. And it was a very similar effect whether they were dealing with high-income countries or low-income countries. When we look at the timing of when that occurs, what is most important about that? We see a very clear dose-response effect. And in this study that was done in the United States, they looked at the relative odds of overweight at 4 years of age and found that the strongest effects were there for the children who were breastfed for at least 12 months of age. Particularly adjusted odds ratios were especially strong when you had breastfeeding for at least 12 months, whereas a very short-term duration of like less than a month or less than 3 months, you have very little difference in the obesity ratios there. So in a meta-analysis published by Harder et al., they looked across a number of studies and added up what the total effect was of continuing breastfeeding. So they really focused in on this duration issue, and they found that each additional month of breastfeeding reduced the risk of childhood obesity by 4%. So it becomes very important to recognize that continuation of breastfeeding out into the 2nd year of life is really necessary for the protection of overweight and obesity. We also know that breastfeeding has important health benefits for the mother herself. and we know particularly the reduction in risk of breast and ovarian cancer. When they looked at that in a dose-response way to see what the effects were of different durations of the total amount of breastfeeding a mother did, they found the strongest effects when the mother breastfed for at least 12 months. In fact, with ovarian cancer, a 37% reduction in the risk of ovarian cancer and a 26% reduction in the risk of breast cancer. And that was also based on a large number of studies. There were 50 studies on the breast cancer and 29 studies on the ovarian cancer. So this is not just a random study that happened to find an effect. This is a meta-analysis across a very large literature. In a meta-analysis by Aoun looking at type 2 diabetes, they found that each additional year of lifetime duration of breastfeeding is associated with a 9% protection against type 2 diabetes. So again, we have to have this long-term breastfeeding to have those kind of maternal benefits from breastfeeding. We're not going to see them if we only focus on exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months of life. And finally, in the absence of contraceptive use, we know that continued breastfeeding delays the return to fertility, which contributes to longer birth intervals, which is beneficial both for the health of the mother and the health of the baby. Again, need to have that long duration to have substantial effects on health. So to summarize that, we can reduce the child mortality by 49% with breastfeeding in the second year of life, contribute to optimal nutrition and preventing growth faltering, can reduce the risk of later obesity by 28%, and can protect the mother against breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and type 2 diabetes. So that's why we have this full recommendation. Early initiation, exclusive in the first 6 months, and continued breastfeeding for the first 2 years. But is it possible? Many countries say that we're putting forward a recommendation that really isn't feasible. And I think it's important for people to recognize that it actually is quite feasible in many countries. We find that a third of the countries around the world actually find that a majority of their babies continue breastfeeding out to 2 years of age. So this is not a rare occurrence, and it is something that we have to protect. If we're going to protect the optimal health of mothers and the optimal health of babies, we need to make it possible for women to breastfeed for 2 years and beyond. This leads us into the question of how does this relate to breast milk substitutes? And as we look at what we mean by a breast milk substitute, if you go back to the International Code, it defined breast milk substitute as any food that is marketed or otherwise presented as a partial or total replacement for breast milk, whether or not suitable for that purpose. Some people have argued that follow-up formula isn't a breast milk substitute because it's not the only thing that a baby needs for their nutrition, and so there should be counted more as a complementary food. But in fact, the code was very clear in saying even if it is a partial replacement of breast milk, that it might be a breast milk substitute. And it said that infant formula is one type of breast milk substitute, but clearly the code expected that there were other kinds as well that would partially replace breast milk. Some people argue that the follow-up formula is not suitable based on its nutritional composition as a substitute for breast milk. And again, the code anticipated this concern and said that it doesn't really matter whether or not it is suitable or not. The fact that formulas have a different composition from infant formula doesn't mean that they would cease to function as a substitute for breast milk. And people sometimes argue that breast milk substitutes are only in the first year of life. But in fact, the code makes no distinction based on age. WHO makes no distinction based on age. The guiding principles for complementary feeding make no differences for less than 12 months versus more than 12 months of feeding. And so there is no logic to saying that 12 months will be a logical cut point for what is a breast milk substitute and what is not. So the real question comes down to is, does follow-up formula act as a replacement for breastfeeding? When we talk about complementary foods, they're consumed in addition to breast milk. The whole idea of complementary is that we continue to breastfeed, but add on additional foods to meet the additional nutritional requirements as the baby is getting older. On the other hand, when a food is replacing the intake of breast milk, that is a substitute for the breast milk. And what the literature has found, this was looked at by the Scientific Technical Advisory Group that developed the recommendations in 2016, is that milk feedings actually do replace the intake of breast milk. When a mother introduces other milk feedings, she is going to reduce the number of breast milk feedings, or she's going to stop breastfeeding altogether. She doesn't add those on in addition to continuing the breastfeeding that she was doing. So it was on that basis that WHO put forward these recommendations, and in the World Health Assembly in 2016, Assembly Resolution 69.9 welcomed the new guidance and specifically called for a number of actors to actually implement them. There's a lot of debate about what does it mean that they welcomed with appreciation. Is this the same thing as endorsing? Is this the same thing as accepting? And the words themselves have to be interpreted by each member state. We can't say that this is the same thing as endorsement because it is a different word that is being used here. But to say that they were not accepted really does not make sense when you follow on to then say, what actually did that resolution say needs to be done about them? It urged member states to implement the guidance recommendations. It called upon manufacturers and distributors to end inappropriate promotion as set forth in the recommendations. It called upon healthcare professionals to implement them, and it requested the Director General to provide technical support in implementing them. So clearly the intention of the Assembly was that these recommendations in the guidance need to be taken up and need to be implemented. I just want to close today with discussing a little bit about some of the implications of this for human rights. We've seen a progression over kind of the history of dealing with human rights, getting more and more specific about the need to protect mothers and babies against marketing of breast milk substitutes. Going back to 1948, we were very general, talking about everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of his family, including food. We'll say specific about breastfeeding. When we moved forward to the rights of the child, we're now talking about the highest attainable standard of health and ensuring that everyone has appropriate education and knowledge about child health and nutrition, including the advantages of breastfeeding. So a specific mention about breastfeeding, but not about the marketing of breast milk substitutes per se, but getting more specific. In 2013, the Committee on the Rights of the Child did start defining this much more clearly and spelled out what exactly do we mean by that highest attainable standard of health. And they said explicitly within that breastfeeding should continue alongside appropriate complementary foods, preferably until 2 years of age where feasible. So within a human rights perspective, they also were calling for 2 years of breastfeeding. And specifically, they said that states are required to introduce into domestic law, implement, and enforce internationally agreed standards concerning the children's right to health, including the International Code and relevant subsequent World Health Assembly resolutions. And we would say that clearly the 2016 subsequent resolution is relevant to the code. The CRC also did put out a general comment number 16 in 2013, where they talked about the importance of the business sector. And here they said that states are required to implement and enforce internationally agreed standards about the code and subsequent resolutions, and specifically pointed out that the activities and operations of the pharmaceutical sector, which oftentimes is the producer or manufacturer of breast milk substitutes, has a profound impact on the health of children. And finally, in 2016, a more specific statement about breastfeeding was put forward jointly from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, sorry about the typo there, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and in Practice, as well as the Committee on the Rights of the Child once again. And in that statement, they were very explicit in calling upon member states that they need to implement the code and the new WHO guidance that we've been talking about here. And they went further to say that adopting such measures must be recognized as part of states' core obligations under the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So this is not just an easy recommendation that WHO says, maybe we ought to do this, wouldn't it be nice? This is really being taken up as a core responsibility under human rights for all signatory states to adopt. That is why it is so important that we protect the promotion of continued breastfeeding out into the second year of life, and we protect it against marketing of products that would interfere with it. So if I can just summarize here by saying that continued breastfeeding up to 2 years of life and beyond saves lives. It promotes the health of the mother and the baby. There is good evidence that follow-up formula replaces the intake of breast milk, and therefore it acts as a breast milk substitute. The World Health Assembly has called on member states to protect breastfeeding by regulating the marketing of follow-up formula, and human rights declarations are establishing the core obligation of states to implement the code and subsequent resolutions. I hope this has been clear in laying out the case for why it's important for us to protect breastfeeding into the second year of life, and do so by making sure that we clamp down on the marketing of follow-up formula, because it is a breast milk substitute and needs to be treated as such in the same way that infant formula is in code legislation and implementation. Thank you for your attention today.